that it would be only through electronic modes. Notice, order, or any other communication would be through electronic mode only. Now those modes are: number one, your income tax portal, that is the assessee's registered account on the income tax business application portal. Second is the registered email address of the assessee, and third, in times to come, they will come out with a mobile application as well, on which the notice or communication will be uploaded, and followed by a real-time alert, that is a SMS on your registered number. So sir, as I highlighted, that the email addresses, the mobile numbers which are given in the returns, which are there on your income tax portal, please, while filing your returns, kindly check them, kindly ensure that they are updated, because along with the notice on the portal, they would come, a real-time alert would come on your mobile numbers as well, and this has been done to ensure that there is proper communication. Number of times we hear this issue कि सर पोर्टल पे था हमने देखा नहीं या ईमेल नहीं देखा. सर, these arguments will not be accepted henceforth, and in fact I'll mention here that earlier, as per the statute, section 282 and 282A of service provided email address as the official way of communication. At that time an argument could have been raised कि सर पोर्टल पे था, ईमेल नहीं आया हमारे पास, and since portal has not been recognized under section 282 282A, then this cannot be a proper communication. However, in the scheme, even the portal, the registered email, and real-time alert, these are the communication modes that have been recognized officially. So kindly ensure that your portal has proper updated email address and numbers, and please make it a point that email addresses which have been given, which are registered, are periodically and timely checked. And also, to my very dear colleagues, please make it a point that in the returns being filed by us as councils, do not mention the email address of the council, rather mention the email address of the assessees. Sir, as we did in the e-filing portal, in the e-filing assessment that we used to do, e-proceedings, once you file your response, then that hash used to come, and that was the acknowledgement of your successful submission of response. Same is the concept here. So once the assessee has filed the response and that acknowledgement has been generated, that is a successful submission of response. Now, a lot of debate has been going on the personal hearing. Now, personal hearing, a concern is there, a fear is there, and to my mind, that fear is more because of the anxiety, because of the because we are still not very aware of the scheme. It is still very new. In times to come, it will evolve, and the scheme, it has been provided that where modification is proposed and assessee makes a request for personal hearing, then personal hearing would be granted. However, the paragraph 12 of the scheme, it has been provided. Paragraph 12 is basically FMPP, format, mode, procedure, and process, that has been provided there. That would be provided and that would be formulated under that paragraph 12, and under the purpose of format, how things will proceed, how procedure will be formulated, all those things have been provided in the paragraph 12. And all these formulations, all these rules which will be provided will be approved by the board. So one of the amendments which have come in the latest notification has been, they have included clause 6B in paragraph 12, which says that the circumstances in which personal hearing will be allowed will be prescribed. So it would be there in the public domain also. And accordingly, if the case of the assessee is falls within those circumstances given under that clause, then the DG or Chief Commissioner would approve the request of the assessee, and that personal hearing would be conducted through video conference. So it has been also provided in the scheme in paragraph 8, an exception has been given in case of if there is some inquiry or verification which cannot be conducted through e-verification, electronic mode, then again some circumstances may be carved out again under clause 6A of paragraph 12, which will again be approved by the board, under which the physical verification can be done. Apart from that, all communications, all personal hearings, all verification would be carried out electronically, and whatever personal hearing would be done through video conferencing. only. Now, sir, this scheme, as compared to the earlier concept, earlier we used to get the 143 notice, then a detailed questionnaire with 40, 45 odd points used to be there on which assessee was required to reply, and then same officer used to figure out on what issues he is to examine further. So the concept which I see going forward, and also is coming out from various representations from the department on various platforms, is that now specific issue-based assessment is what is the way forward. Sir, you may kindly recall amended Form 26 AS has been brought. SFTs, specified financial transactions, are there, which are, the scope of which has been enlarged, and accordingly data is being received by the department. Then data from banks is being received, from various regulatory authorities data is being received. So there is ample amount of data which is being received by the department, and accordingly based on the data mining, data matching concept, the cross-sectoral mapping of the various financial data points is the concept on which the matching would be done. Sir, you may kindly recall that number of times it has been addressed by even our honorable PM has said that assessees are not filing returns. The number of assessees making foreign travel, buying foreign currencies, buying luxury cars are much more than the people filing returns. So that concept of that the return should be commensurate with the activities of the assessee. So the data which is being received by the department from various sources is what would be matched with your return to see whether the activities of the assessee are commensurate with the return or not. And wherever they will have their red flags, verifications would be done, and if proper reply is submitted, that is good enough. If not submitted, then obviously assessments will be done, and on specific issues assessments will be done. That is what I see is the way forward in this whole concept of faceless assessment. Now the advantages: transparency, accountability, efficiency, which is embedded in section 143(3)(a), that is bound to reduce litigation. So as we saw, functional specialization is there. Then team-based assessment. One assessment order is being, the mind is being applied by number of persons. So it has been examined. Review unit is there who is checking, who is ensuring that the assessment is a quality assessment, and accordingly, the in times to come, the grievance of high-pitch assessments would be greatly reduced. Then quality assessment would be expected. Greater and better utilization of resources of the department would be for the welfare of the country. Then you are sitting at home, you don't have to, the SSC's council don't have to sit in the department, wait for hours, and that whole time is reduced. Then ease of compliance is there, you can sit in your office, send the replies, you can spend your time in examining the issue as opposed to waiting there. And then even in this current scenario of COVID, lockdown, travel restrictions, the assessment can be carried out. So all these advantages would, to my mind, and the anonymity and the absence of human interface, will go a long way in addressing the issue of harassment and by way of overpitch assessments and the instances of corruption. So in all, I feel the advantages are quite a lot. Obviously, initially, we think trouble would be there, but I can say that the way we have been seeing in the way department is actively participating in all the webinars and the kind of education that they're spreading, they are quite proactive and they're open to feedbacks and they're open to all the healthy criticism to ensure that the system works in a robust manner. Now, the challenges to my mind, one is lack of infrastructure and technology capability to handle documents. So to my mind, already we have this facility of 10 attachments of 5 to 10 MB per attachment to be uploaded. So if proper system and technology is used, it would not be a problem. Still, I can definitely share with you that in one of the platforms from the representative I heard that from in December they would be coming out with a much more robust system of technology that can handle the returns, the electronic portal, which is the working load to much more higher extent. Just for an example, as on date, the CPC has the capacity to handle process 6 to 7 lakh returns per day. The robust system which they soon will introduce will then process 1 crore returns per day. That is the kind of technology advancement the department is eyeing at. And even in respect of the technology to handle this portal, as an example, we were told that last year in single day, in July and August end, 96 lakh returns were filed in one day. And the portal worked absolutely fine. And in fact, in times to come in December and way forward, much better robust system will have come, which will have much better capability. There would be no downtime. So initial teething trouble are there, but in times to come, that will also be taken care of. Then, sir, as I discussed with respect to the technical unit being there, technical assistance being there to the assessing officer, a standard view being taken by the department, clarifications coming from there, more clarity about their viewpoint on various issues of tax and law, then it is bound to reduce litigation. Then the third issue which I want to highlight here is that, and that would happen since in the scheme it has been provided that in case an assessee is based in Delhi, then the assessment would be allocated to a unit which is outside Delhi. So say for example, if a Mumbai assessment unit is required, is doing the assessment, then while processing the assessment, while making the assessment, which High Court will it follow? In case Mumbai High Court has taken an adverse position, whereas Delhi High Court is in favor, then what would be the position for the assessee? So sir, the thoughts which we are seeing are coming is that the jurisdictional High Court of the assessee would be followed. So that would be through the technical assistance of the technical unit, and accordingly the technical unit will give the assistance and the position of law would be settled. So initially obviously teething troubles would be there, but these things will also be clarified. Last but not the least, sir, one issue which I want to highlight and which I want to discuss here is the effect of section 120 subsection 5. So I bring the sections in front. Now you may kindly recall section 2 subclause 7a, subsection 7a, which defines the assessing officer. The assessing officer is assistant commissioner, deputy commissioner, assistant director, deputy director, or income tax officer who is vested under 121 or 2 or any other provisions of this act, and the additional commissioner, additional director, joint commissioner, joint director as director under 120 subsection 4 clause B. Now this is just an extract of the notification number 64 by which the income tax authorities have been prescribed of the NEAC. And the kindly note, I will read the initial 4 or 5 lines of this notification. In pursuance of the powers conferred by subsection 1, 2 and 5 of section 120 of the Act, the Central CBDT hereby directs that the income tax authorities of the NEAC having its headquarters so and so shall exercise the powers and functions of the assessing officer concurrently to facilitate the conduct of faceless assessment. Now you may kindly see the table below. The first authority is Principal Chief Commissioner of Income Tax. Then we have number 3 is Commissioner of Income Tax, and accordingly in this notification we have additional assistant, deputy, and all those authorities there. Now the point I want to highlight here is that, and kindly I just read subsection 5 of section 120. The directions and order referred to in subsection 1 and 2, wherever considered necessary or appropriate for the proper management of the work to facilitate the conduct, require 2 or more assessing officers, whether or not of the same rank, same class, to exercise and perform concurrently the powers and functions in respect of any area or person or class of person or classes, and where such powers and functions are exercised and performed concurrently by the assessing officers of different classes. Any authority lower in rank amongst them shall exercise the powers and perform the functions as any higher authority may direct, and the further references in any other provisions of this act, in any rule thereunder, to the assessing officer shall be deemed to be the such higher authority. So sir, to my mind, reading 120 subsection 5 and this notification, the assessment orders being passed by the NEAC would be referred as if the assessment order passed by the Principal Chief Commissioner. So first question is whether he can be an assessing officer. As we just saw in the definition under section 2, subsection 7A, he is not the assessing officer. Although I'm cautious that under the notification number 61 of 2020, subclause 7A has been mentioned to make sure that the scheme is working in exception, modification, adaptation to such section. But the point I want to highlight is whether by taking power under section 143, whether even the definition of the assessing officer, whether more assessing authorities, income tax authorities can be added into the assessing officer is a question I am raising before the August audience. Secondly, if the assessment order is being referred to have been passed by the Principal Chief Commissioner of Income Tax, then how will the actions under section 263, 264 will take place by the CIT? If an authority higher to their rank has already passed the assessment order, I really fail to see how that would work. Then, as we discussed, that once the assessment order is passed, the reports would be sent to the jurisdiction assessing officer. Now, how will he sit over the order passed by an officer of the higher rank to rectify it? So this is, to my mind, a legal issue which may arise, and in times to come, we may see that this may be resolved. So with this, I'll conclude, and I'll request Sir to come in to give any additions to the faceless assessment scheme. And with this, I thank everyone for the patient hearing, and over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Atul ji.
Sir? So meanwhile, sir comes, like I'll just share that faceless appeals also. As I said, faceless appeals that is proposed to become effective from 25th September. And again, the concept is to take on the same lines of bringing greater efficiency and more bring more transparency, and again to reduce the interface, to introduce the team-based concept of appellate procedures also. Just a second. Okay. Sir, kindly unmute him. Sir, host, kindly unmute, sir.
Yes.
Sir, hello. Sir, host, kindly unmute, sir.
Yeah, Somil ji कर रहे. Wait a minute. Somil ji, wait a minute कर रहे.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, you are unmute now.
Yes. Now, thank you, Somil, for having deliberated upon the aspect of faceless assessments. Definitely, I mean, this is going to be something new. There are lots of ifs and buts and apprehensions, curiosities, unanswered questions. When anything new of this magnitude and of this sort is introduced, obviously these things are to be there. And but then it appears to me that overall situation in this field of facelessness would ultimately benefit to the system and to the public at large. Now the topic which is there for me is about the appeal. In fact, during this pandemic period, I have almost addressed about 75 plus webinars, and some of the topics are bound to be repetitive, and therefore that repetitiveness of topic, I mean, poses a challenge to me as to how would and should I introduce some kind of, I mean, newness into that topic. But one thing which is very good about my audience is this is a quality audience. who are well informed audience, and therefore I need not to traverse through the basics of the provisions, the basics of the appeal. And therefore, I try always in my deliberations to touch upon certain practical issues with which we all practicing chartered accountants and lawyers do confront ourselves. And following this principle and keeping this principle in mind, yesterday I and Somil flashed certain issues to our friends, to our connections, and with this preamble that we would try to touch upon these issues. So in the field of appeal, as I said in the beginning, the facelessness has not yet come. It's only the declarations given by the Prime Minister that day that it will be unveiled on 25th September. 25th September is a date which is in the womb of time. Let us keep our fingers crossed, and then on that aspect of the facelessness, in the light of the rules, in the light of the scheme which are yet to be unveiled, then we will take up this session later on. So the first issue in respect of the existing law of appeal is, and which I see day in and day out, and I have seen my chartered accountant friends asking these questions very often, that when any adverse order comes, then there is an independent and parallel jurisdiction which is also available for an SSC to avail, is seeking the rectification of any error which the SSC, or for that matter on his behalf, you as a practicing chartered accountant consider as an apparent error. And therefore, with a view to seek rectifications of the purported apparent error, you move a petition under section 154 before that authority. If that order has been passed by the assessing officer, before him, or if it has been passed by the commissioner appeal, then before him, under this hope that the rectification order will be passed, if not in favor, but then at least the order will be passed. And therefore, many of us do ask this question: now, should we hold back our right to file an appeal against that original order till the time that this rectification order is passed by that authority before whom this rectification petition has been moved? Now, I would always say that filing of appeal is a time-bound action. There is a time limit which has been provided in the statute. If it is an appeal against the order of the assessment, then you are given 30 days time. If it is an appeal against the order of the CIT appeal, then you have got 60 days time. And if you file appeal beyond this prescribed time limit, then that appeal will be delayed filing of appeal, and then that will invite a judicial discretion to be exercised by the higher appellate forum before whom the appeal is preferred, as to whether in the facts and circumstances of that case the condonation should be granted or not. So if you are confronted with this kind of a situation whereby you have been persuaded to move a rectification petition, but then rectification petitions, based upon my experience of 3.5 decades, I can say is not expected to be disposed of within a period of 30 days or 60 days. You will be fortunate if rectification petitions, if at all, are disposed of. Therefore, kindly do not wait for the disposal of the rectification petition, and please exercise the right of filing of appeal, that too within the time, positively. Because if you file later on, rectifications are carried out in your favor, then you are at liberty to seek withdrawal of the appeal from that appellate authority. But once rectification petitions do not go your way, are not decided in your favor, then in that situation, you having not filed appeal against that original assessment order or original order, now you have rendered yourself in a situation whereby if you happen to file an appeal against that original order today, then that appeal will be exceptionally delayed appeal. Though you may move a condonation petition to the higher appellate forum on this premise that you waited for a rectification order to be passed and that is why this delay has happened, but then that may not be very sufficient and good reason for seeking delay. Anyway, but then I would say even if that may constitute a justification for you to seek condonation, but then why to put yourself in a situation whereby you crave for the exercise of discretion of some authority. Now, if you, by filing appeal in time, can as a matter of right ask that appellate authority to show its indulgence in the disposal of that appeal on merit, then why to lead yourself in a situation whereby before asking for the disposal of appeal on merit, you ask that authority to exercise discretion first to condone the delay. Therefore, my experience, my suggestion, my humble view would be that never wait for any rectification order for the purpose of seeing whether you have to file appeal against that original order or not. And then kindly see. Now, in case you happen to file appeal, many times I have seen, even in such a situation, my friends, what do? They do not file appeal against that original order. They file appeal against the order which has been passed by that authority under section 154. Now, by filing appeal only against this order under section 154, again, you have caused a serious prejudice to creep in against your client. And that prejudice is because you having filed appeal only against that rectification order has restricted the scope of your arguments to this extent only, whether that error was apparent or not. Whereas had you filed appeal against that original order, then the entire gamut of all your grievances, would have been raised by you before that appellate authority. That there is a mistake of fact, there is a mistake of law, it may not be apparent, and this is the view. And therefore, as all of us know, that the jurisdiction on the aspect of an apparent error is restricted only to see whether that mistake is so obvious, patent, that it does not admit any other view at all. Only then that error can be said to be an apparent. Therefore, by not going in for filing appeal against that original order, you tend to create several prejudices against your case, cause, and against the case and cause of your client. So why to lead yourself in such kind of a situation? On the same lines, I would also say, you must have seen that in certain cases the assessing officers make some protective addition in somebody else's hand. Now, when the protective addition is made, this is made on this premise that the substantive addition will be made in somebody else's hand. Protective addition, though, is permissible in law, but then the protective recovery is not, and therefore one can tend to take a view, since there is no recovery which is going to take place in his case on account of this protective assessment. Therefore, since it is not going to pinch me, so why to file an appeal? Now, later on, in the hands of the person in whose case the substantive addition has been made, if that addition has come to be deleted, then this protective addition will partake the character of the substantive addition. And therefore, in that situation, now, since that order having not been challenged by you, now you may be persuaded to challenge that order in appeal at this stage. And when you think in terms of challenging that order at this stage, much water has flown in Ganga since then. 30 days time must have gone well past. And therefore, you have tried to score a self goal by not filing an appeal against the protective order. So the bottom line, which I always say and suggest to my friends, is that every order which is an adverse, which may not be adverse today, but then which can become or which can turn to be adverse at any point of time in future, or whose adversity may appear to be somewhat soft, but then there is no adversity can be said to be soft, and therefore in all circumstances, all adverse orders. Now, according to my wisdom, many times my chartered accountant friends, because we deal too much about the finances, then we say, oh, the tax involved is this much only, whereas the cost of appeal in terms of the fee and the filing fee or the fee to be paid to chartered accountant, that will be more, and therefore the clients also tend to overpower us. But it is not the question of the financial stakes. Any adverse order which is passed, if is allowed to sustain and remain, you never know when and where would it sting you, and the way and the time it would sting you. Now, by that time, much time must have elapsed, and the damage which it would do, the damage which it would do now may not be comprehended at this stage. Therefore, never lead yourself into a situation whereby you may be compelled to call for some judicial mercy to be shown by any authority, something which as a matter of right you can exercise. Then why to lead and land yourself in a situation whereby you crave for the mercy of an appellate authority, howsoever that mercy may be the judicial mercy. I'm not saying is a mercy simpliciter, but then mercy is mercy, whether it is a judicial mercy or is a mercy simpliciter. Even if it is a judicial mercy, that mercy has got an element of some amount of arbitrariness. Therefore, why in the first instance to lead yourself to that kind of a situation? Therefore, even if these prima facie adjustments are received from the CPC, within 30 days you file an appeal against that intimation. You keep on pursuing any other remedy which is available to you in the form of 154 or any other tope which you have in your armory. But then don't let those issues which are time bound the time to elapse. That is the bottom line which you all must bear in our mind. The next issue which I have raised and which many times my very learned chartered accountant friends do ask. Now we file form 35. There is a clause, a statement of facts. Now the question comes, now it is not a question of law. It may be a question of law a little bit, but then I am speaking on the question of expediency. Now whether the statement of facts now should be elaborately mentioned in form number 35. And if yes, then why? And if not, then why? Yes. Now, we have got very time bound 30 days from the date of the receipt of the order. And 30 days time for filing appeal is no big time which has been given or which has been doled out by the legislature to us. Now, as a practicing chartered accountant, there are many other things for me to do. There may be several appeals which have to be filed in respect of the several my clients. Therefore, one may be pressed or one may be racing against time. One may be pressed with time. Now, therefore, in such a situation, now if you try to incorporate very comprehensive facts in form number 35 within that constrained or contrived time, there may well be the possibility that you happen to commit something on facts in the statement of facts which may well operate against you in times to come. I'm not saying that the facts once you admit now cannot be unadmitted or cannot be shown to be perverse, cannot be shown to be that this is not the correct fact. But then I always say, then why to lead yourself in a situation whereby you, instead of channelizing your energy for contesting the case on merit, now you are diverting your energy first of all to displace what you have committed at one point of time. Now, therefore, my suggestion on expediency aspect is that for the purpose of compliance, because I have been told that unless you write something in the statement of facts, that form 35 will not be uploaded. And therefore, for the purpose of making compliance of this requirement that you have to write something as a statement of fact in form number 35, then you give minimum facts. And those facts may be like this: the return was filed this much, assessment was made of this much, these additions have been made, and which are under challenge. That's all. Now, later on, when you file your written submission, you have got ample time at your disposal. You have got ample time, energy to concentrate on the issues having regard to the facts. And therefore, at that time of peace, if you state the facts, obviously, when you will prepare the written submissions, you will prepare the written submissions having regard to the facts. And therefore, the facts which you try to furnish within that short time of 30 days, when you are already preoccupied with so many appeals, And now at peace, later on, say after 6 months or 8 months, you prepare written submissions at your leisure and pleasure. Now there may well be the difference. So something which can be filed later on with no prejudice, had there been some prejudice, then definitely I would have also fallen in line what you say and what you think. This I am sharing with you based upon my experience of 3.5 decades as a chartered accountant, as a lawyer, as a member of the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, and as an SSE. And I have got 360 degrees profiling of this tax department. And therefore, based upon that, I am suggesting on the aspect of expediency, not as a matter of law, that statement of facts should be filed in peace, at leisure, at your pleasure. Therefore, no commitment as to the facts may come to be existing on record, which can later on be placed against you, or which later on can stare at your face. No, you have taken this factual position in your form number 35. Later on, you are changing the facts, and therefore this inconsistency in the facts made by you now is going to be pitted against you. Therefore, when something is not going to be prejudicial by not giving comprehensive facts at later stage, then why not? So this is my humble suggestion. Now, which grounds of appeal should ordinarily be raised? Yes. Which grounds of appeal should ordinarily be raised? And if you remember the next issue which I raised, which have got some kind of linkages with this issue, is how and why should grounds of appeal be made, and in which manner? My each issue has got 2 or more questions embedded in them, like how and why. So the first question is, how should the grounds of appeal be made? Why should the grounds of appeal be made? In fact, the why should grounds of appeal be made comes first in precedence. Then how should the grounds of appeal be made? And then in which manner should they be made? And the earlier issue was that which grounds of appeal now should ordinarily be. So I will take them together. So first of all, why should grounds of appeal be made? Obviously, the answer is that unless I raise the grounds of appeal, which are nothing but the grounds of grievances, and since the appellate authorities are obliged under the law to deal the grounds of grievances raised by an appellant, therefore it is incumbent in law for me as an appellate, as an aggrieved person, to raise grounds of appeal in the form of the grounds of grievances. So far as the why should I raise the grounds of grievances, grounds of appeal, now that stands answer. But then how should the grounds of appeal be raised, and in which manner? Therefore, for that we do not find any guidance from the Income Tax Act or income tax rules. Though there are some guidance which are available in case of the Appellate Tribunal Rules 1963, insofar as the grounds before the tribunal is concerned. But then the basic law of pleading, now that demands and that commands that the grounds of appeal should be concise and should not be argumented. I have seen, and I can vouch with whatever little command at my disposal, with utmost humility, I can say that many times my chartered accountant friends, they fill the grounds of appeal with insurmountable amount of their emotions and sentiments, as if this entire word is going to drown. No, that is not the place. Grounds of appeal is not the place to be dominated by your sentiments, to be dominated by the arguments. Your grievance should come in a very clear and concise manner, without any arguments, without any narratives. But of course, all grievances must be raised. I am coming to that aspect, that which can be the grievances which should be which would be and which ought to be raised. Therefore, that basic principle of pleading that should be borne in mind, that we have to prepare the grounds of appeal which have not to be argumentative, which must be bereft of narrations, which must not be consisting and comprising or including our sentiments. No, arguments are not to find place in the grounds of appeal. There are better places for us to put our arguments in the written submissions. You put them or you argue them. In case if you are before the tribunal, you argue. Now before the CIT appeal, since it will also become faceless, then invariably our arguments, will have to be uploaded electronically, meaning thereby that it has to be in the written form only. So it has to be non-argumentative, it has to be concise, all grievances must be read, because when I say that it should be concise, it doesn't mean that because of the necessity of I being concise and therefore I leave something which should find place in the grounds of grievances. No, the conciseness doesn't mean, to be concise doesn't mean that my real grounds of grievances should not come. Therefore, the question comes as to which grounds of appeal now should ordinarily be raised, though there cannot be hard and fast, or there cannot be any blanket proposition that which kind of grounds of appeal should be there, or it depends upon the facts and circumstances of each case, which can be decided having regard to the contents of the assessment order. But then a broad, important guidelines based upon my whatever little experiences I do have, now I want to share. And I must tell you, I am seeing very many very affectionate faces of my friends. Mr. Atul Puri is there, Ravindra Agrawal sir is there, Anil Bagai sir is there. So they know, Atul Mehrotra sir is there. They know as to I am on a mission. And that mission is that whatever little I have learned in all these years in whatever capacities, I must share it with my professional brothers and sisters. And therefore, having been overpowered by that kind of a feeling, which is very intense in me, now I would proceed to suggest as to what should be the grounds of appeal. And obviously, depending upon the fact, then you can further articulate, or then you can modify, and you can then make them, or you can tailor make them. First of all grounds of appeal must start with this ground, that your appellant, your SSE, denies his liability to be assessed. Now, why I am saying so? Because this ground that you deny your liability to be assessed, I can say my several friends are watching me, and they watch me almost on alternate day speaking in some webinar, and may have heard me on the aspect of appeals on earlier occasions also. Therefore, as I said a little while ago, that it becomes a challenge for me as to how I should bring some amount of the novation in by this deliberation. And many of you may probably wonder, those who may have heard me on earlier occasions, that this aspect was never discussed by Rakesh ji on earlier occasions. But anyway, it's better late than never. And obviously, within the time of 1 hour or 1.5 hours, there is always a limitation. Yes, so I was on the aspect as to what should be your first ground and why should it be your first ground. Because we all are well-informed citizens. So unless somebody tells us that you have to do this, that's all right. But then why you have to do this? That reasoning also should come. Only then it gets implanted in our brain. So denial to be assessed. Denial to be assessed. Now you see how many things my client is denying. He is denying his liability to be assessed, that amount at which the assessing officer is assessed him. My SSE is denying his liability to be assessed on a portion of the additions which have been made by the assessing officer. My SSE is denying his liability to be assessed in this year for which the assessment has been made. My SSE is denying his liability to be assessed not only in respect of the assessment, but in respect of the interest which has been levied. My SSE is denying his liability to be assessed in the status in which that appellant has come to be assessed. my SSE is denying his liability to be assessed in the residential status in which that assessing officer has come to assess him in that status. So, with one stroke of this kind of an omnibus ground of appeal, which is all embracing, now, and therefore at later point of time, if your SSE is found wanting, though ideally he should not, but then if for any reason he is found wanting, oh, this ground was somehow omitted to be taken, but then you can always fall back upon this ground. You can always fall back upon this ground while you move an additional ground. Sir, though you are raising this additional ground as a matter of abundant caution, but then in any case, this additional ground which is sought to be raised by you in any case is covered by ground number 1, where your appellant have denied his liability to be assessed. And therefore, in that situation, it will be very difficult for an appellate authority to overcome your this kind of an argument. Anyway, so the liability to be assessed denial. Now that should be, it is my view. I mean, there are much more learned persons. I mean, but then whatever I can feel, I feel that I must share, I am sharing. The second thing which must come regarding the assumption of jurisdiction by the assessing officer. Now somebody can say, sir, jurisdiction, he was my assessing officer, and therefore if he proceeded after assuming jurisdiction, because the jurisdiction was already vested in him. No, I'm not talking of the territorial jurisdiction. The jurisdiction may be the legal jurisdiction also. That this assessing officer, though was clothed with territorial jurisdiction, but then cannot be said to be having legal jurisdiction. So if an assessing officer has reopened by assessment under section 147, then the very assumption of jurisdiction to reopen a concluded assessment I am challenging. And this very assumption of jurisdiction, if I challenge, then that comprises what not? That he assumed jurisdiction to reopen my assessment when there was no material in his possession which could have led to the formation of belief of escapement of it. He assumed jurisdiction despite the fact that there was no material, or even if there was some material, that material was not having live nexus with the belief of escapement of income. Even if there was some material having live nexus with the belief of escapement of income, but no income can be said to be, no income chargeable to tax can be said to have escaped assessment. So even if there was material, that material was having live nexus with the belief of escapement of income, though income chargeable to tax has escaped assessment. But then this case, now which is sought to be reopened, now could not have been reopened inter alia for the reason that it is barred by limitations, or the jurisdictional conditions under the first proviso to section 147, because original assessment having been made under section 143(3), and in the reason recorded there is not even a whisper or allegation as to the failure of the assessee to disclose a material fact is there, and therefore the assumption of jurisdiction of an assessing officer is there. And therefore you, as an aggrieved assessee, if happen to raise that the assessing officer has erred in assuming jurisdiction under section 147 and to pass the impugned assessment order accordingly is bad, has erred in assuming jurisdiction, and thereafter then you can articulate any of these arguments which are subset of this larger grievance that the assessing officer has erred in assuming jurisdiction. Now, reference, if any, made by the assessing officer to the district valuation officer, or assessing officer has not made a reference to the district valuation officer. Now, under section 142 capital A, the assessing officer can make a reference to the assessing officer. So if he happens to make, or under section 55 capital A, he can make reference to the district valuation officer, and both references operate in different fields. So if an assessing officer happened to make a reference to the district valuation officer, then your assessee, why should he not feel aggrieved against the very action of an assessing officer in making reference to the district valuation officer. And you don't challenge it. You don't challenge it. Why should there be even an iota of reason, howsoever small, remote or far-fetched that reason may be? Why should your SSE not feel aggrieved that why assessing officer made a reference to the district valuation officer and has taken assistance of an officer who is not the assessing officer? I'm not saying that always you would tend to succeed. I'm not saying, I'm not on that aspect. But then unless you challenge it as a ground of appeal before the appellate authority, then how would you challenge it or would make your submissions comprehensive before the appellate authority? And I tell you, I have my own experiences. I have my experience that many times at the time of drafting of ground of appeal, I may not be so sure whether I would be able to sail through ultimately before the appellate authority. But then, you keep on becoming wiser every day with passage of time, with experience which you gain. And therefore, a particular point of view may not be appearing to be sustainable at the time when you tended to draft the grounds of appeal. But then by the time the appeal comes up for hearing, some judicial development takes place, you become wiser on several counts, and therefore then you are able to make out the case. Oh, then the CIT appeal, or for that matter even the tribunal, may be constant to say, yes, you have got a point. Or conversely, if the assessing officer ought to have made a reference to the district valuation officer, like under section 50C subsection 2 or under section 43CA subsection 2, when you have transferred some immovable property being land or building, whether you held them as capital asset or you held them as stock in trade, and the consideration received in both the cases less than the stamp duty value, because the subsection 1 of these two sections clear-cut mandate is then the stamp duty value shall be taken as the full value of consideration. But then subsection 2 gives you a power based upon which then you are entitled to raise objections before the assessing officer. No sir, real fair market value is far lesser than the stamp duty value. You kindly appoint the district valuation officer. And your SSE having raised this objection before the assessing officer, and yet assessing officer, out of his sense of absoluteness, oh, the legislature says that he may appoint district valuation officer, and since the legislature says that he may, and since he is bridled with unbridled power to exercise his discretion not to appoint district valuation officer, and therefore he chose not to appoint a district valuation officer, then why should your SSE not feel aggrieved against his this kind of the brazen violation of the position of law? But then it must come out in your grounds of appeal. So when I say that your ground of appeal should be even in respect of an assessing officer's attempt in making reference, and in certain situations in not making reference, despite under the law he was obliged to have made reference. I mean, you must. I'm seeing that my very good friend Atulji is making note. It gives me an immense sense of satisfaction. Definitely. Anyway, non-observance of the natural justice. Yes, you need to write only one thing, that the assessing officer has erred in not observing the principles of natural justice. And now you see, by writing non-observance of principle of natural justice, now what you are assailing, that your SSE has been condemned unheard. Your SSE has not been supplied the adverse material. Your SSE has not been allowed the opportunity to cross-examine some adverse deposition against him. All these are part of the principles of natural justice. We often say that the principle of natural justice, and we often tend to believe as if it is with respect to the non-making the adverse material available. No, there are three principles of natural justice. Nobody should be condemned unheard, which we often call as audi alteram partem. The second, nobody can be judged for his own cause. And third, every order or quasi-judicial order or judicial order must be speaking. These are the three principles. So by raising this ground of appeal, that the assessing officer has erred in not observing the principles of natural justice, now you can raise any amount of arguments later on in your written submissions, which can impinge upon that the material was collected by the assessing officer at the back, which was not made available. What to say of confronting? What to say the copies have not been given? The depositions which has been recorded either by the investigation wing or by the Securities Exchange Board of India or by the assessing officer. Now that has not been made available to me, and the cross-examination has not been made available. So next, incorrect finding of facts. Now, every quasi-judicial authority in Ramraj though should not have recorded any incorrect finding of fact, but ironically we are not in the Ramraj. And we had seen all sorts of the officers. I'm quite conscious that some of very brilliant officers are also listening this webinar. They are all brilliant who are listening. I'm aware with utmost regard. But then I am privy, to thousands of orders whereby I can say what I am saying today, that not all officers, I'm not saying that there were extraneous reasons for them to record those kind of findings, but then there may well be an error in the judgment also. After all, they are also human beings made of bones and flesh like me and you, and therefore to err is human. So by any reason, if certain findings have come to be recorded wrongly, and obviously if had the findings not been recorded wrongly, then probably their conclusions also would not have been different. Whether the direct findings have been recorded erroneously or whether the findings which have been inferred now have come to be recorded wrongly, because on the set of facts, if some findings have to be inferred, now there can well be the difference of opinion, there can well be the difference of view. So the direct facts may come to be recorded wrongly or the inferred facts may come to be recorded wrongly, and because of such facts having been recorded wrongly, then a serious prejudice has been caused, and that serious prejudice is reflected in the form of an erroneous decision arrived at by that authority, against which you are filing an appeal. And therefore in such situations, if there are patent incorrect recording of findings, then you must take a ground that the assessing officer has erred in recording incorrect finding of facts. Now which finding have come to be recorded incorrectly, that may well be the matter of an argument which you can raise it in the form of your submissions which you will make before the CIT appeal. Or not considering the evidences. You need not to point out as to which evidence has not been considered by. So, because there may well be the strong possibility that the assessing officer, while discharging his quasi-judicial function, not in that judicious manner, I would say, now may have not considered the evidences adduced and produced by you. So in that situation, if you raise a ground that the assessing officer has erred in not considering the evidences, or the findings recorded by the assessing officers are perverse, the perversity of findings. When can a finding of fact be said to be perverse? Though at the level of assessing office of the CIT appeal or the tribunal, we may not be using these expressions. We use such kind of expressions by the High Court, because the High Court can or has been vested with the jurisdiction under section 260 capital A only when there is a substantial question of law. But many times you must have seen the High Court even peeps into the facts also, and therefore the question comes now, under which circumstances the High Court can go into the facts. The High Court can also go into the facts if it is urged before the High Court that the finding of facts recorded by the lower authorities are perverse. Perverse means that either some finding has been recorded without reference to any evidence, or when some finding has been recorded by the lower authorities by considering some evidence which is a relevant evidence. And in that situation, even the finding of fact recorded by the lower authorities, arrived at by the tribunal, and tribunal is considered as the final fact finding body. And ordinarily, The findings recorded by the tribunal now are final, attain finality, unless of course the aggrieved party urges before the High Court that such findings are perverse because of the reason that some relevant evidence has been ignored or some irrelevant evidence has come to be considered. And in that situation, the courts have said that even in such kind of perversity of fact, there is a substantial question of law which is involved. Anyway, so I traversed much more beyond the scope of today's discussion, but then it has got some kind of oh, where has gone? Just a minute, my notes are lost. Oh, it was deleted. I do not know how was it deleted now. Since it can remain there for 30 days, therefore I've been able to access it. Anyway, yes. The next issue, why and how? As I said, that there are two questions. Like in chartered accountancy papers also, we used to see question 6. It was divided in two parts, A and B. There used to be a clear-cut demarcations. In my questions which I raised, I have not made any demarcations. The why and how paper book should be prepared and filed. Why should it be filed? First of all, I must advert to this question. After all, I am aggrieved SSE. My SSE is an aggrieved person. My SSE, being an aggrieved, has knocked at the door of the appellate authority to seek redressal of his grievance. And therefore, since he is a person who is craving for justice to be administered on him, though when we say the justice should be done, the justice should be done to both parties, SSE as well as to the revenue. But then it is the SSE who is pained at the assessment order or the finding the assessment order, or for that matter in penalty order, or for that matter in respect of any adverse order against which an appeal has been preferred, and therefore it is the SSE and the SSE alone. Now, who wants relief? And therefore it is incumbent upon him in his own interest that he must supply to that appellate authority all those pleadings and evidences which he has raised down below, or he may not have raised down below, but then they are relevant for the purpose of effective adjudication of this appeal. Of course, in that situation, it will be called additional evidence, to which I will come little later. So it is in the interest of that SSE to file paper book consisting of all those letters, all those pleadings, all those evidences which have got bearing on the outcome of that issue, and that too in his favor, because after all, he would not like some issues to be decided against him. So, paper book should be filed for this reason. In fact, when you all are there before me, if any of you now speaks on your own telephone, and really I suffer from the vice, or I suffer from the sense of inferiority complex, that probably I may not be having any better things to do. So if you want to talk, you want to do something which can distract me, because I can see you only. Therefore, kindly keep your camera off, because I do not know, many of you may be hearing for the first time. Many of you may have heard on earlier occasions also. I always say that it is a way, when I speak with my audience, it is a way to meditate. I communicate with God, and therefore, for my own interest, please help me to meditate. Yes. So, why paper book should be prepared and filed? But then how the paper book should be prepared? Because as I said, it is in the interest of an aggrieved SSE who is seeking justice from an appellate authority, therefore to impress upon that appellate authority that in the light of these pleadings, arguments raised by him, and in the light of these evidences, now this issue needs to be decided in his favor, and therefore the paper book must comprise, must consist, must include all those pleadings in the form of your letters, submissions made by you, and the evidences filed by you before the lower authorities, which you seek to press, and by seeking to press, you wish to impress the appellate authority to decide the issue in your favor. So paper book is an amalgam, or the paper book is a docket, or which we can say is a smaller assessment file, because in assessment you must have furnished lots of evidences, and qua many evidences there may not be any adverse observation in the assessment order, and therefore you are not required to deal with those evidences. So in the assessment order, in the assessment report, if this is the width, or this is the thickness of the file, and there are certain issues with reference, so this is a pruned assessment record, and which should be indexed, which should be paged, and reference of each evidence or each letter which finds place in the paper book, having what linkages with which ground of appeal, in what manner, that must come out in the index. That will be very helpful for the appellate authority to appreciate. Now in the face of the faceless appeal, which we all are going to witness, the importance of preparing the paper book and then chain indexing with precision, what inference you want to draw with reference to each page which you enclose in that paper book, that has assumed all the more importance. Because when you were interacting with Commissioner Appeal, you used to sit across the table with him, and then you could have, because you could have at that stage impressed upon, by showing the evidences, by your expressions, by your words, by your arguments, explained so many things which your papers probably would not or may not have conveyed those things in that manner. Therefore, in the face of this faceless appeal, now which is almost appearing to be imminent and inevitable, it becomes all the more essential for us to be somewhat more diligent, more livid, more intelligent, more alert as to the importance of the paper book, the way, the manner, the mode, the modus operandi, as to how that paper book has to be prepared, then indexed, the inference to be drawn, linked with your written submissions. It is very important. The next issue is how the additional grounds, when and how the additional grounds and or additional evidence should be raised and filed. So ideally, my guru told me, Mr. K.C. Singhal, my guru, who used to be vice president of the tribunal, he told me when in 1984-85, when I qualified chartered accountancy, I went to meet him. At that time, he was practicing. Now he told me, Rakesh, if you lead yourself in such a situation whereby you are forced to move additional evidences, then you take it as if half of the battle is lost. So what does it mean? It means that when you represent it before assessing officer, then you should be in a position, based upon your experience and expertise, to visualize, to envisage, to contemplate, to see through as to which evidence on facts would be required to convey which point for all times to come, and therefore that evidence should have come before the assessing officer. And some evidence which has come before the assessing officer, you as a matter of right can file it in the paper book, and that appellate authority is duty bound to take cognizance of that evidence. उस अपीलीय अधिकारी के समक्ष और कोई विकल्प होगा ही नहीं कि उस साक्ष्य को संज्ञान में ना ले, इसका कोई विकल्प है ही नहीं उसके समक्ष. So avoid that situation, but then you cannot avoid all situations. Therefore, when you think that some evidence which was also relevant for the purpose and have bearing on the outcome of an issue which is pending before the appellate authority, but which could not be filed, then it would be called as an additional evidence. you are though entitled to file it, but then with certain ifs and buts, with certain conditions. Similarly, all grounds of appeal must be included in the appeal memo. But then there may well be the possibility that some ground was not raised by you. Therefore, section 250, subsection 5, though gives you the power to file an additional ground, but then that right which has been given to you to file additional ground is clothed with corresponding obligations. And those obligations are that you have to impress upon that appellate authority that your prayer for filing this additional ground or this omission not to file this additional ground is the appeal memo is not willful and your prayer is not unreasonable. Therefore, when you are confronted with this kind of a situation whereby you are forced to move an additional ground which was not raised by you in original appeal memo, then you must prepare a petition, and that petition must indicate as to what is the additional ground which you want to raise and why this omission from that original appeal memo was not willful, that you have to bring out, and your prayer is not unreasonable. Only then the commissioner appeal, and that too after hearing the opposite party, that is the assessing officer, because it is a justice not only to you but then the justice to the both parties. I remember I had an occasion to argue a matter before the tribunal, and it was a case of an additional evidence. Justice Mr. N.S. Chopra used to be the accountant member at that time. I said, my lord, in the interest of justice, now this evidence should be admitted. I do remember very vividly, because in the initial years of your life, something which is said, now that becomes an embedded, almost permanent in your brain. I do remember he said, yes, of course, we are here to effect substantial justice, but then not only to you, we have got the other party also, substantial justice to both. And therefore, commissioner appeal for that matter also has to extend substantial justice to both parties. And therefore, this additional ground which you will move now would compel the commissioner appeal as an adjudicating authority to confront that ground to the opposite party, seek and elicit the response from the opposite party, and then would have to take a conscious and judicious call as to whether this ground, if at all, should be admitted for consideration or not. You forget about the adjudication on merit, that will come later. So I always say that had you included this ground in your original appeal memo, in that situation you could have asked as a matter of right to that appellate authority, sir, that ground was there in the appeal memo, kindly adjudicate it. Now, you having not included it in the appellate ground, now have created this kind of a situation where you are craving for justice, even for the purpose of admission of that ground, which was otherwise your matter of right. Similarly, any evidence which could not be filed by you, it must be moved by you with a petition. Never remain under this impression that you can slip and ship any evidence in the paper book, even if it was not filed before the lower authority or before the assessing officer. Now, entire electronic record will be available to the commissioner appeal when he would dispose your appeal, even in this faceless regime of appeal. Because that electronic record can be accessed from any place, anywhere. And therefore, when that electronic record would be accessible to him, then he would see that the evidence which you are seeking to place not as an additional evidence, in fact, is an additional evidence or not. So therefore, this evidence which was not filed you, then you will have to move a petition. You will have to list out as to what has led you not to have filed it at that time up to the close of the assessment, and what prevented you from filing this at that stage, and what are the compulsive reasons that you are now constrained to file it. We have got Rule 46 capital A. This your right and obligations to file additional evidence is codified by the rule making authority pursuant to the exercise of power which is there under CBDT under section 295. Rule 46A having been made part of the Income Tax Rules 1962, you'll have to make out a case that you were not heard. Assessing officer decided an issue without adverting to this aspect of this issue, or you were prevented by adducing this evidence when you were called upon to file.